Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session with Buck Shlegeris on AI safety. I'm Sophia Davis-Fogel, and I'll be the MC for this session. We'll be starting with a 15-minute talk by Buck, then we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he will respond to some of your questions. You can submit questions using the box to the right-hand side of this video. You can also vote for your favorite questions to push them higher up the list. Buck Shlegeris does independent research on topics related to long-termism. He worked at the Machine Intelligence Research Institute from 2017 to 2020, doing a mixture of research and outreach. Without further ado, here's Buck.
Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Buck. I'm super glad to be here. I want to tell you how I think college students should orient to AI safety. For bonus content on this talk, including the Google Doc where I wrote it, you can look at the link that I've provided there and read all the places that my friends think that various points I've made are subtly wrong. All right, so my background. I ran across Less Wrong when I was in high school in 2010, started reading about AI safety and wild animal suffering and GiveWell and all these interesting things. I was in university from 2012 to 2014, the Australian National University, where I wore colorful clothes and played music sometimes. I was a software engineer earning to give from 2015 to 2017. 2017 to earlier this year, I was working at Miri doing a mixture of recruiting and movement building and AI safety research stuff. And I'm now working on various independent projects. So I want to talk about how to orient to AI safety. So by this, I mean maybe a level of abstraction higher than I think you should learn about this particular topic, or I think you should study this particular thing. I want to give you my sense of how you should be prioritizing what things to do. My assumption about you is that you're a college student who thinks AI safety is plausibly important. I sometimes assume you're a person who wants to do AI safety technical research and knows computer science and math. I sometimes assume that you're someone who does AI safety, who wants to do AI safety technical research. In as much as something isn't aimed at you, you will figure it out through context and it'll be good. All right, so my key claim is that you should try to engage with the content of AI safety while you're in school. And by engaging with the content, I mean something like you should be trying to read things that are written by AI safety researchers for AI safety researchers, and you should be trying to come to your own opinion about the answers to the questions of the answers to the questions that are most important to the field. So I don't think you should do this because I think that you'll come up with lots of great stuff on your end necessarily, but I do think that doing this kind of thing makes it more likely that you end up having good judgment and doing useful research eventually. So I don't think that this is just trivial advice. For instance, I wouldn't give this advice to someone who wanted to be a theoretical physicist or mathematician, because I think that if you try to read cutting-edge theoretical physics or cutting-edge math while you're in school, you will basically fail to understand it and waste your time, and you should be focusing on learning the basics. I think this is, roughly speaking, not true of AI safety. I'll come back to talking about that in a bit more detail later. The reason why I think this is important is that I think we really need people who've tried to think through the whole thing. By that, I mean something like people whose AI safety research is guided by a specific model they have of why the things they're doing are going to reduce the probability of AI existential risk. Not everyone thinks that this is obviously true. The reason why I think it's important for AI safety to have people who've tried to think through the whole thing is that in my experience, AI safety researchers who have clear pictures of the goal of their research are more likely to do research which seems to me likely to actually reduce existential risk. Another reason for this is some of the most valuable work that I've seen on AI safety research from the last few years, in my opinion, falls into the category of trying to think through the whole thing. So for instance, I thought Ben Garfinkel's stuff and Richard No's stuff from recently were both pretty cool. Though, of course, we'd expect the proportion of research in AI safety that's kind of high level to fall over time as we know more about what we're doing. I also think that AI safety people having thought through AI safety more makes the field a bit healthier and makes it seem smarter to outsiders. I think that if you don't have an opinion on the route via which your work leads to a reduction in existential risk, you're gambling on the person you're working for having a good sense of this, which I think is reasonable in a lot of cases. I think it's nice to preserve the option of not having to make that gamble. And that's why I think it's valuable to try and think through the whole thing. Yeah. So, all right, so here's your sold on wanting to think through the whole thing. What are the things you should think about exactly? I want to break it down into two categories. First category here is high-level forecasting questions. The most interesting forecasting question about AI risk is what's the probability that we all die due to AGI? I think that thinking through what you think this number is valuable, not just because the number is pretty interesting, but also because I think that once you've thought it through, you will have built for yourself a concrete model of what leads to AI risk being higher or lower. So if one of the things that was part of your estimate was, how hard will various companies try to do various AI alignment things, and then you'll realize that anything which increases the probability of that is going to reduce your estimate of existential risk. I think this is a real effect. Another high-level question, which is pretty interesting, is what will the world look like in the 5 years before and after AGI? This is related to questions about takeoff speeds, and obviously it plays into the question of what's the probability of extinction quite a lot. Seems very important to me. The other type of question is technical questions about AI safety, of which I think the key one is something like, what are the alignment strategies that are scalably safe and competitive? By which I mean, what are the alignment strategies that keep being aligned when the system is really smart and aren't hopelessly incompetent compared to AI systems with a similar amount of resources being thrown into them? Those are the questions I think are most important. I want to go back to my claim about how AI safety compares to other fields, where I was saying that it is in some sense shallower than math and physics because it doesn't have deep chains of prerequisites. It's not that far to the cutting edge, is another way of saying that. I think that there's probably something like 1 to 2 undergraduate courses of AI safety content and 4 to 8 undergraduate courses of prerequisites, where by AI safety content, I mean like the basic explanation of things such that afterwards you can read the alignment newsletter and understand basically the context for all the new research which is happening. I think that AI safety has kind of a similar amount of prerequisites to advanced data structures and a similar depth to some parts of this field. So in Stanford and MIT, there are these courses called advanced data structures. I think the one from Stanford has particularly good lecture notes. And these courses have final projects where you have to come up with some data structure stuff. And the people who do these courses sometimes end up publishing their final projects. I think AI safety is something like as deep as this, where it's not unreasonable to think that after your second course in a particular path, you're saying things that are new and interesting. Some other ways AI safety compares to other fields is I think it's kind of a Wild West kind of situation. One way in which this is true is there isn't really a textbook for AI safety. So a lot of the time when you want to learn things, you're having to scrounge around random blog posts. Various people are trying to make this better in various ways, of course. I think there are a reasonable number of AI safety arguments that are folklore in the sense that they haven't really been written down, but they're just a thing that AI safety researchers have said to each other over the course of however many years. I think it's really great when people do write these down. Another fun fact about AI safety is I think there are a lot of hidden prerequisites, by which I mean other subjects like machine learning or algorithmic information theory, where a bunch of we've imported a bunch of jargon and ideas from these fields, often not in a super deep way, such that you'd be fine if you just read the Wikipedia page rather than having read the, done the relevant undergraduate course. But that still makes AI safety a little bit harder to get into than a lot of things, and you should be very willing to open up Wikipedia when there's something you don't get. So I want to talk about 2 mistakes that I see students making sometimes about AI safety. So one of them is taking the ideas in the field insufficiently seriously, where they don't spend as much time as I think they ought to reading things that the AI safety research community is coming out with, thinking that they should instead spend all of their time learning more computer science or machine learning or math, and planning to just learn the bits of AI safety that they need later. I think that this has the tendency to leave people kind of bad at steering themselves towards the right problems in AI safety. Like, according to me, a lot of the value to be created comes from having a deep understanding of the specific things people have talked about inside the field of AI safety. It's not like there is a huge number of shovel-ready tasks where we just need people who are very good at this particular technical thing to come in and solve these nice open problems we have, though that is a little bit true sometimes. I think there's kind of an inverse mistake that people make as well, where they take the field too seriously and think that it's hopelessly inaccessible because people have surely built giant layers of abstractions on top of each other such that they'll never be able to understand the cutting edge and never be able to contribute to the discussions until they are far more experienced than an undergraduate. I don't think that this is the right call either. I think it's better to start reading this stuff and arguing about this stuff when you're an undergraduate. I think that it's very normal for undergraduates to have very reasonable understandings of what's happening in AI safety. So a question that I want to talk about specifically, which is kind of off the theme of thinking that you should get really deep into the actual content of AI safety, is whether you should get really good at machine learning. I think the answer is you should probably get reasonably good at machine learning. So if you get really good at machine learning, this means that you're able to do certain kinds of AI safety research that I think are really exciting. So OpenAI needs some people to help them align GPT-3. I think this is just quite an exciting thing that they're working on over there, and I really hope they succeed at it. And the only way to produce value there is being really good at machine learning or programming. So I think that if you're the kind of person who would plausibly get really good at machine learning, it's probably worth your time to try and do that. On the other hand, I think there are many parts of AI safety research that don't rely basically at all on being good at actually doing machine learning. For instance, writing Richard No's piece on AI safety from first principles, or a lot of other types of research. I think that basically everyone who wants to do technical AI safety research should probably know basic machine learning things like how to train a neural net, how convolutional neural nets work, how deep Q-learning works, similar things to this. You can see a longer list in my Google Doc for this post. And most people involved in AI safety technical research should probably know substantially more than that. This is because I, to some extent, buy the argument that knowing more about machine learning just means you have a better sense of what's going on and you're less likely to do research that is just predicated on some really dumb assumptions about what machine learning is like. Different researchers differ on how far that goes. So there are some people who think that if you don't know really a lot of machine learning, you're just going to have really dumb opinions about AI safety. And you're just going to, your intuitions are going to be substantially off. I personally am not persuaded by this. I think there is like one really good example of someone having a really good AI safety idea that I had completely missed because I didn't know any machine learning. And I just definitely would not have thought of that because I did not know some particular machine learning facts. But I don't think this is massively ubiquitous. The main thing in AI safety where it seems really crucial to know lots and lots of machine learning is if you want to, in fact, do good via training models, which I think is a pretty reasonable way of doing AI safety stuff. So my overall take here is I think that if you want to do AI safety research and you're planning to get a STEM major, you should probably spend like 20 to 80% of your effort that you're spending on AI safety on learning machine learning. And you should decide between these extremes by thinking about how good you seem to be at machine learning compared to other things and how enthusiastic you are about spending more time on it. So here are some concrete suggestions about what things you should maybe do. I think you should go to Evan and Ossea's talks. Evan's talk is about the technical question I was describing earlier. What are strategies for building scalable and competitive aligned AI systems? It's based on a post of his, which I think is one of the best posts to try to read to orient yourself to the technical questions of AI safety. Ossea's talk is about what some interesting research, according to her, about AI safety. Based on her experience writing the AI alignment newsletter and reading a bunch of AI alignment stuff. So along those lines, my reading recommendation is the AI alignment newsletter. I think the AI alignment newsletter is great. It covers all different parts of AI alignment and more general machine learning results. I think that there's a whole lot of stuff. I think it's just like very well worth your time to read those summaries. I have a longer list of recommendations on my website, as mentioned. Sometimes I run workshops, the AI Risk for Computer Scientists workshops or other workshops. I'd love to have you apply to those if we ever run them again after this terrible COVID times. And yeah, I would love to get emails from Yol and answer questions you have. Evan Kubinger is also down for answering questions about AI safety stuff over email. That's my talk.
Thank you for that talk, Buck. I'd love to dive right into some questions. One of your suggestions is for students who are interested in AI safety to engage with the content of AI safety by reading things that are written by AI safety researchers for AI safety researchers. Later in the talk, you mentioned the alignment newsletter, which anyone can sign up for. But aside from things like that, people may be wondering how they can find or access this type of content. Can you give some specific suggestions?
In my bonus content doc, I have a list of some of my favorite resources that I think are good along these lines. I think also the AI alignment newsletter is just a really excellent resource because it has relatively accessible explanations of a wide variety of different AI safety things. So I think that would be my first recommendation. But in my doc, I recommend the things that I think are the best things along the categories I mentioned.
Fantastic. Okay, that's great. Thank you. You also said that we need people in AI safety who've tried to think through the whole thing, by which you mean people whose AI safety research is guided by a specific model they have of why the things they're doing are going to reduce the probability of AI X risk. I think this is an excellent insight and that the reasons you give are quite compelling. But one fear I have is that this might sound quite intimidating for people who are just starting out thinking about this field and wondering how to dip their toes in. So I think you did a great job of explaining why it's worth it, but I'm wondering if you have any comments you can add to help people understand why it might not be as daunting as it sounds.
Yeah, so I guess one thing I want to say is just because you have an opinion on the answer to this question doesn't mean that you have to rely on it being correct. I kind of think of these as separate exercises, one where you're trying to answer these questions and the other one where you're deciding what to do. And I think that, for example, when you're trying to decide what to actually do, one thing you should be really excited for is finding someone who's a more experienced AI safety researcher than you to say that they really need this particular thing done, just because I think that's a better learning experience. I think that's the first part. I think that I agree that the question of these questions of, what's the probability of AI X risk and what needs to be done to reduce it are quite hard and daunting. It doesn't seem like there's anyone who's particularly qualified to answer them there. So it's not like you're entering a field with lots of qualified experts. It's more like everyone is trying to figure out things to the best of their abilities in a field where everyone is kind of an amateur. You can't get degrees in this. And so for that reason, you might expect to do less badly compared to the best qualified people that you otherwise would.
Yeah, that's great. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's quite helpful on this point. The first major question that you named is, what is the probability that we all die due to AGI? And you recommend that people spend some time developing a model that will inform their view here. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of talk about what are some good reasons for people to really grapple with this themselves instead of just deferring to current experts. And I recognize that part of your recent answer kind of addresses this, but I'd love to kind of just draw that out a little more.
Yeah, so an example of something specific which I once upon a time didn't realize, an example of a place where I think I was thinking about AI safety research wrong because I hadn't thought sufficiently about the route to impact of the AI safety research is, I think one of the great things that Paul Cristiano has pushed over the past few years is claiming that AI safety research should be aiming to make it as cheap as possible to implement whatever alignment strategies are going to be safe. So this is the competitiveness concern. And I think that this is really obvious in hindsight or something. Like, you can kind of think of it as there's two goals of AI safety. You want to make it so people are willing to spend as much as it takes on building aligned systems instead of unaligned systems. And you also want to make it as cheap as possible to build aligned systems instead of unaligned systems. And so in as much as you can come up with an alignment strategy that is only 10% slower than an unaligned thing versus 50% slower, this makes you a lot better off. And this is an example of an insight that I hadn't thought of on my own. And I think that the kind of strategy that would have led me to think of this on my own is something like trying to think about, if I'm trying to think like, what's the probability that bad things happen? I'd probably want to say something like, well, I have the following distribution over how much tolerance people will have for AI systems being more expensive in return for them being aligned. And I just have some distribution here, and we're okay as long as we are to the right of the minimum cost required for alignment. That's an example that feels compelling to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Okay. So one thing that somebody from the audience asked, and I think is a really great question here, is how dependent are these thoughts? And I gather they mean just sort of all the thoughts that you've mentioned in your talk so far. How dependent are these thoughts on your AI progress timelines?
I guess it seems to me that in worlds where AGI is really soon, like in 5 or 10 years, we probably need to be spending more of our relative effort on aligning current systems. And so that's going to mean that good strategies look a lot more like becoming really good at machine learning and then trying to find some of the people who are working on aligning current systems. I don't know. I guess it seems like they seem relatively robust to different timelines I could imagine. I think that if I imagine thinking AGI happens in 15 years versus 40 years, I don't think that changes very much of my guess here. If AGI is going to happen in more than 50 years, then I stop thinking that it's a good idea to work on it in the same way that I'm currently thinking, because I think it's just very hard to do useful technical research for something which is happening 50 years in the future. I say a lot more about this in my Stanford talk on personal crutches for working on AI safety.
Great, great. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Okay. So you talked about what you refer to as the shallowness of the field of AI safety. And I'm wondering, do you expect that this shallowness is due to the relative newness of the field, or are there intrinsic characteristics of AI safety that make it this way? And I ask because, you know, again, similar point to in your last answer, but I expect that an assumption that the field will deepen relatively quickly might serve as an incentive for people to get involved sooner rather than later. So it feels like it could be decision relevant for people in the audience here.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think that part of it is that the field is kind of young. You know, AI safety has been around for 20 years or something. Computer science also feels like a shallow field. So for instance, it's a lot easier to do cutting edge computer science research while you're an undergraduate than to do cutting edge, you know, whatever kind of like particle physics research. I think part of this is that AI safety, so I expect this to some extent to just continue being true into the long term. Machine learning also feels like a really shallow field in that I think there just like aren't 3 semesters of good content on machine learning that are well established or something. You know, I have the deep learning textbook is from 2015 and already feels like pretty out of date. So I think that's evidence against the hypothesis that having a whole bunch of people working on the field for another 10 years is going to make it feel a lot deeper. I imagine there'll be a lot more stuff, and each of the little subfields will have a lot more interesting little ideas in them. But it wouldn't surprise me if, compared to theoretical physics, it just like never gets that deep.
Right. Right. So a follow-up question, you know, and this is also submitted from the audience, is somebody's interested in whether you think it's too soon for an AI safety textbook. And, you know, to some extent, I think, yeah, I mean, you could think that, you know, the tendency for a textbook to go out of date very quickly is maybe a reason not to write it, but I'm not entirely sure that that's a given. So I'm curious what you think about that.
I'd love for there to be a textbook on AI safety. The main problem is that all of the people who I think would do a good job of writing this textbook are already doing really good AI safety research. And that seems like a shame. I've seriously considered putting some of my time into writing a really, like, the shittier version of a textbook is like a list of posts. It's like taking the list of texts that you would make, that you would rewrite all of yourself in order to make a textbook. I've seriously considered doing this. I would love for this thing to exist. It wouldn't surprise me if one of these does exist in the next 5 years, and that's great.
Do you imagine that that's something that somebody at maybe undergraduate or master's level could help flesh out? Like if somebody like you or somebody else more experienced in the field were to make sort of that slimmed down version or just the bare bullet points, does that seem like a project that somebody could take up and kind of flesh out into like a more textbook?
So I think there's kind of 2 parts of making good explanations, in my opinion. One of them is clearly writing down ideas that have already been established. And the other one is really deeply understanding the ideas and taking them apart and putting them together again in a new way such that the understanding is just easier. And I think this kind of conceptual labor where you try to break down the ideas and like spot connections and figure out the best order of explaining them, I think this kind of does rely on having a very deep understanding of the field. So for instance, I wouldn't trust myself to do this very well compared to people who have a much better sense of the field. I think that it's not crazy to imagine undergrads being able to help out with this. But because of the fact that I expect most of the effort goes into arranging the ideas to start with, that doesn't seem particularly, it doesn't seem like a thing where I imagine undergrads could spend a lot of time on.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for maybe just one more quick question, and hopefully you can answer this quickly. But somebody asked, industries implementing AI safety measures means taking a hit in revenue. How successful have AI safety researchers been in making industries implement their suggestions so far?
So the goal of AI safety is to make it so that implementing AI safety measures doesn't mean taking a hit in revenue, I would say. In as much, my answer is actually kind of subtle. That's my main part of it. It seems like the goal is to make it not take a hit in revenue. I think AI safety organizations have approximately no success in making industries implement their suggestions, except for OpenAI, where they just really want to make GPT-3 not say racist things or whatever, because that's important for their goal of making an enormous amount of money. Check out Paul Christiano's recent EA forum post about trying to hire for this if you want to know more about that.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's about all we have time for. I really appreciate it, Buck. This was a great talk. And before we end, I just wanted to remind you all to take part in the EA Student Summit Forecasting Tournament on Elicit. You can find this at the Swap Card homepage. The Center for Effective Altruism will donate $500 on behalf of the most accurate forecaster across all 7 questions. The winner can direct the donation to any of the funds or organizations listed on EA Funds. And they will also be offered a 30-minute call with Jonas Vollmer, head of EA Funds, to provide advice on their donation decision. So thank you everyone for watching. And before you leave the session, please give us your feedback in the polls. Bye.